Relativism in some form is a really old view. Versions of relativism go all the way back to the ancient Greeks. But basically, for as long as the view has existed, the challenge has been to sort of make sense of its fundamental notion. Relativism often appeals to relativism about truth in some way, and people have often found it baffling how truth could in any sense be relative. What does it mean to say that truth is relative? And there are all sorts of worries and arguments against relativism that take this as their fundamental driving point. How do we make sense of truth being relative? Now, of course, Macfarlane is a relativist, so he must think that there's a way of making sense of this challenge. And the way that he wants to reply to this challenge is by saying, well, actually, when you look at the kind of philosophy of language that we've been doing, and that is particularly popular and has seemed to be successful in giving us a theory of what certain words mean, we see that we already have a notion of truth that's relative to a whole bunch of things. So we've already seen that in some respect because we've talked about sentences being true relative to a context. But in fact, once you do some more philosophy of language, you see that sentences have to be true relative to a bunch of other things as well. They're going to have to be true relative to not only context, but worlds, times. Some people think it would be relative to things like standards. There's going to be a whole selection of things that truth is relative to. Basically, Macfarlane's strategy is going to be to say, well, once we see this fact that truth already is relative in a bunch of ways, it's not a huge step to add one more thing to our views about meaning that make meaning, or at least the meaning of particular things, look much more like relativists of the past had in mind. There are going to be ways to use this kind of understanding that we get from semantics and philosophy of language to actually maybe make sense of some of the kind of core ideas of relativists. So we're eventually going to work towards that thing that Macfarlane does, this idea that you add in particular a context of assessment to the meanings of sentences. But before we get there, it's going to be helpful to cash out this claim that when we're doing the theory of meaning for various things, we need to add a bunch of other things. So we need to add things like worlds and times. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to do it in a rather amount of detail, in particular for the case of times. I'm going to go through the arguments that people have given for the conclusion that the notion of truth we need for doing philosophy of language has to at least be relative to both contexts and times. We need truth to be relative to both of those things in order to have a good theory of meaning of how temporal expressions work. So that's going to be the case we'll look at for most of the video. I'll also extend it very briefly at the end to worlds, because we're going to draw a contrast in general between two different kinds of thing that truth could be relative to. On the one hand, truth is going to be relative to contexts which behave in a certain way, and they're also going to it's going to be relative to other things called indices, which behave in rather different ways. I should say, understanding all the details of what's going to happen is not strictly necessary. Basically, the main idea that I want you to take away is this idea that truth is relative to a bunch of things, and the sense that adding one more thing that behaves in a relativist-like way is not really that much of a cost to intelligibility. So if you don't understand exactly everything that follows, don't worry. It's not going to be essential for what's going on, but I do want to sort of present you with the arguments for thinking that truth has to be relative to a bunch of different things. And also, by working through how it works, hopefully you also see that making truth relative in this way is not a fundamentally scary thing, or it's not a fundamentally unintelligible thing. The ways in which truth is relative to things like context and times in orthodox semantics is actually perfectly intelligible and seems to make perfect sense. Since we're going to talk about what relative truth means, what it means to be true relative to a context of assessment, we need to think a little bit more about the notion of truth that we've been using so far, and in particular we need to add the notion of an index to our definition of truth. So we've already seen the notion of being true at a context. Remember, contextualism said that the same sentence, like Alice knows that the bank is open, can be true or false at different contexts, even holding fixed all the facts about the world. But we need to complicate this notion of true at a context before we get to relativism. And before I tell you how we're going to complicate it, let's see why we need to complicate it. So there are two different kinds of expressions that show us why we need to complicate it. We can see it by looking at temporal expressions, and we can see it also by looking at modal expressions. Temporal ones are a little bit more familiar, so we're going to start with those first. So let's just take two example sentences that I've written on the board. The first is that John is going to eat for lunch what I am eating right now, and John is going to eat lunch in an hour's time. And let's imagine that in the context I'm saying this, I'm eating a cheese sandwich, for instance. So what I'm eating right now, in the relevant context we're considering, is a cheese sandwich. We've already said a bit about the semantics for now, what now means. We said that now just seems to pick out the time at which the sentence is being said. So when I say John is going to eat for lunch what I'm eating right now, the now just picks out the time at which I'm speaking. Hopefully I haven't got my mouth full. You might just think then that we should treat other expressions like in an hour's time in exactly the same way. You might think that in an hour's time just means an hour later than whenever the sentence is said. So to spell this out a little bit more, we can give a little theory in terms of true to context for both the meaning of right now and in an hour's time. So I'll let P just stand for sort of any sentence. And our theory could be that P right now is true at a context if and only if P is the case at the time of the context. So I'll write T sub C. This means the time of the context. In other words, the time at which the sentence is being said. We could then just give exactly the same treatment to in an hour's time. We could say that P in an hour's time is true at a context if and only if P is true in an hour later than the time of the context. In other words, P in an hour's time is true whenever you say it, if P will be true in an hour from whenever you said it, from the time of the context. So on this view, even though right now and in an hour's time pick out different times, they work in essentially the same way. On this view, the way they work is by reference to whatever the time of the context is. So right now just picks out the time of the context. In an hour's time doesn't pick out the time of the context, but it does work by reference to it, because it says, well, I pick out sometime an hour later than the time of the context. And when you apply this little theory to the sentences we start with, so far it looks good, because it does look like when I say John is going to eat for lunch what I'm eating right now, I am talking about the time whenever I'm speaking. Likewise, when I apply this theory to our second sentence, it does look like, when I say in an hour's time, I'm talking about some time in an hour from whenever I'm speaking. So far so good. The problem is actually, when we think about these sentences in larger contexts, we actually see there's a very important difference between the way right now and in an hour's time work. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the very same sentences we were looking at before, and we're going to put them in a larger environment. So here the two sentences are, on Monday afternoon, John was going to eat what I am eating right now, and on Monday afternoon, John was going to eat lunch in an hour's time. So we can see the sentences that come after on Monday afternoon are basically just the same sentences as we were considering before. But now, we can actually see that putting the two sentences in this other environment, embedding them under this, what we might call operator, as we say. This is some semantic speak. We say that we embed a sentence within a larger one when it's a proper part of a larger sentence. So when we embed these sentences that we were looking at before inside larger sentences, we begin to see that there's actually a big difference between how right now and in an hour's time work. So one way to see this is to just apply the little toy theory that we came up with a second ago to these sentences and see what they say. Okay, so we said that right now basically just picks out the time of whenever you're speaking. So on that theory, the sentence on Monday afternoon, John was going to eat what I am eating right now, says that this sentence means, or when here, the right now is talking about whenever I'm speaking. So this sentence says, On Monday afternoon, John was going to eat what I am eating right now at the time at which I'm saying this very sentence. This looks like a good prediction. Because, remember, we imagine that I'm eating a cheese sandwich right now as I'm talking. This looks like a good way of saying, like, John was planning to eat a cheese sandwich. Because what I'm saying is, he is going to eat, on Monday, this earlier time, he was going to eat the thing that I am eating right now at the time at which we're speaking. So far, so good. It looks like we're actually getting this sentence right. This is where the problems start. When we think about this claim involving an hour's time, we see that our earlier theory isn't getting things right. So think about what this claim says. On Monday afternoon, John was going to eat lunch in an hour's time. When I say that, what do I mean? And in particular, in an hour's time from when? Do I mean an hour's time from sometime on Monday afternoon, whatever time I meant to pick out here? Or am I saying in an hour's time from now, the very moment at which I'm speaking, which is later than Monday afternoon? It looks like the answer is the first thing. I'm not saying in an hour from now, the very time I'm speaking. I'm saying an hour from whatever time on Monday afternoon that I'm talking about. If I say on Monday afternoon John was going to eat lunch in an hour's time, I'm saying something like he was going to eat lunch at 2 p.m. on Monday. I'm not talking about like today, Saturday. I'm talking about whatever afternoon this was. But that's not what the little theory we came up with a moment ago says. The little theory we came up with a moment ago says that when I say, even here, an hour's time, I should be talking about an hour's time from now. So on this theory, this sentence should be saying something extremely strange. It should be saying, on Monday afternoon, John was going to eat lunch in an hour's time from now, the moment at which I'm speaking. That is clearly not what this is saying. It's clearly not making a weird claim like that. When I use the phrase an hour's time here, I'm not talking about the time of the context. And I'm not even talking about a time sort of by reference to the time of the context. The time of the context has nothing to do with how I figure out what time I'm speaking about here. Rather, it has everything to do with this earlier phrase, on Monday afternoon. It's this earlier phrase, on Monday afternoon, that tells us an hour's time from when are we talking about when we use this phrase, an hour's time. So what this shows us is that when we're thinking about how time works, when we're thinking about how to give a semantics for temporal expressions, we need more than just contexts. We can't do it all just in terms of context. We need something else. Because we tried doing it with contexts, and we saw, well, it gets some of it right. It gets the expression right now right. But it doesn't get this other kind of expression in an hour's time. And in particular, the fact it seems to be missing out on is that the reference of this time is not fixed by the time at which we're speaking. Rather, it's fixed by this earlier temporal expression in the sentence. So we need a new theory which will do better. So what we're going to do is we're temporarily going to get rid of contexts. And we're going to introduce a different notion of just being true at a particular time. And we're going to see how by doing this, we can capture some of the behavior of things like on Monday afternoon and in an hour's time. So let's see how things might work in this slightly simpler theory. So you might say that a claim like P in an hour's time is true at a given time, T, just in case P is true an hour later than T. So if I say I'm eating lunch in an hour's time, that sentence is true at a particular time, just in case in an hour later than that time, I'm going to have lunch. So, pretty simple. Let's look at on Monday afternoon. So we'll assume that works similarly. We'll say on Monday afternoon, P, claims of that form are true at a given time, T, just in case P is true at some time on Monday afternoon. So if I say on Monday afternoon I was eating lunch, a claim like that is true at a time, just in case it was true on Monday afternoon that I was eating lunch. One thing that's worth noticing here is that when we have on Monday afternoon, the time here sort of drops out. Because basically claims like, or Because basically expressions like on Monday afternoon say, well, forget whatever time you started with. Let's just go look at some time on Monday afternoon and see whether the claim is true there or not. So far, so intuitive. There's nothing kind of particularly strange or groundbreaking here yet. What's important is to see what happens when we combine these two expressions together. So what we have here on the top, first of all, is a picture of time. So here, this line is representing time, so this is time going forward, this is time going backwards. We're going to pretend that this area here, all the area on this line, this area of the line corresponds to Monday, and this chunk is Monday morning, this chunk is Monday afternoon, this chunk is Monday evening. And we'll just say that t here is just some time in the future of all this. So I've divided even a little bit more finely. So here we have noon Monday, 1 p.m. Monday, 2 p.m. Monday, and so on. And let's just suppose lastly that John ate lunch at 2 p.m. So I'll write lunch above it so we can remember that. So what we're going to do is we're going to consider our original sentence, because what we're trying to see now is that when we combine the two entries that we had before, so our theory of how on Monday afternoon works and our theory of how in an hour's time works, we get something interesting. They combine in an interesting way, and they combine in a way that actually looks like what we want for this sentence. So remember, this was the problematic sentence from earlier. Okay, so let's think, what does it mean on our little theory for something like this to be true? Let's start by working with the Monday afternoon bit. We said on Monday afternoon, P is true at a time, so let's consider at this time, it's true at a time just in case P is true at some time on Monday afternoon. So here the P that we're considering is this, everything that comes after the phrase on Monday afternoon. So it says, on Monday afternoon, John was going to eat lunch an hour later is true at a time, just in case there's some time on Monday afternoon such that P is true there. So we got to ask, is there a time on Monday afternoon where this is true? So we're focusing on this. Is there a time on Monday afternoon such that John was going to eat lunch an hour later? Well, we also know how to figure that out. The claim John was going to eat lunch an hour later is true at a time, just in case it's true an hour later than that time that John is eating lunch. So what this claim says in total, putting those two things together, it says this whole thing is true at a time, just in case there's some time on Monday afternoon, such that an hour later than that time on Monday afternoon, John eats lunch. So let's see one more time what happened. We first started with on Monday afternoon. That sent us from our original time to some time on Monday afternoon. Then this phrase sent us an hour later than that. So we first moved to Monday afternoon because of this phrase, and this phrase moved us to a different time a little bit in the future. So we've kind of gone backwards, and then we got a little bit forwards. And the reason why this went a little bit forwards is because it says, basically an hour later says, I send you to an hour later from whenever you're evaluating this full sentence. But if this full sentence is under something like on Monday afternoon, then you're not necessarily evaluating this at like t, the time you started with. Rather, you're evaluating it at the time that this thing already sent you back to. Another way of looking at it is that what time this picks out can be shifted depending on what else is in the sentence. If all we had was this, if this was our entire sentence, an hour later would mean an hour later than whenever we're evaluating the full sentence. But because we have this phrase on Monday afternoon at the beginning, that shifts the reference of an hour later. We're not talking about an hour later than whenever evaluating the whole sentence. We're talking about an hour later than whatever time on Monday afternoon we have in mind. So what we've seen is that this different way of doing the meaning of in an hour's time and on Monday afternoon, where we have this notion of true relative to a time, actually does better with the sentence that was problematic for us originally. Because what we needed was for the meaning of an hour later to sort of depend on what else is in the sentence. the fact that an hour later comes after this phrase on Monday afternoon somehow means that when you talk about an hour later, you mean an hour later than sometime on Monday afternoon. And that's exactly what we got by the theory we saw on the other side of the board. Because there, the meaning of on Monday afternoon first sends you to Monday afternoon, and then an hour later sends you to an hour later than the time at which you were sent to on Monday afternoon. Now remember, what we wanted to explain was not just the meaning of in an hour's time, but we wanted to explain a contrast we saw between in an hour's time and right now. And we actually haven't fully explained that contrast yet. So it seems like we've kind of explained what's going on with in an hour's time, and we did that by replacing the notion of truth at a context with just truth at a time. But we now can't explain, since we've gotten rid of the context, we now can't explain what's going on with right now, with the expression right now. So I'll just show that by giving a simple theory along the same lines for right now, and showing you that it gives the wrong results, so that we're going to have to do something a little bit more complicated. So the obvious way this would work would be to say that, well, the sentence P right now, or a sentence of that form, is true at a time, just in case P is true at that time. So right now does nothing to the time. You just stay at whatever time you started with. In the same way that when we put an hour's time under Monday afternoon, that shifts what time we're talking about here. This theory will say, once you put right now under Monday afternoon, because it's under Monday afternoon, this time is going to be shifted to now talk about Monday afternoon. And we kind of have already seen enough to see why this is not the right result. But let's go back to the picture and see why. Okay, again, so we have our picture of Monday afternoon. These are all the times in the afternoon. And we're evaluating our sentences at some time in the future. So this is sometime, not on Monday. What does our theory say about this? Well, the first part is the same as before. On Monday afternoon, John was going to eat what I'm eating right now is true just in case there's some time on Monday afternoon where the rest of the sentence is true. So there's some time on Monday afternoon where this is true. And when is this true? And in particular, does that send you to a different time? Well, we said no. On the theory we're working with, P right now is true at a time, just in case P is true at that time. So in fact, on that theory, right now is just sort of redundant. On this theory, the sentence, on Monday afternoon, John was going to eat what I am eating right now, says that there's some time on Monday afternoon, shows that John was going to eat at that time on Monday afternoon what I was eating at that time on Monday afternoon. So on Monday afternoon sends us back here, and right now doesn't sort of do anything. We just stay at whatever time we move back to. So this means that in this context, because it's coming after on Monday afternoon, right now is talking about some time on Monday afternoon. But that's wrong, remember. Right now doesn't work like this. In fact, right now seems to talk about, well, whatever time you started with. So if I'm saying this on, let's say this is sometime on Tuesday, and again, we'll imagine I'm eating a cheese sandwich. What this says is, on Monday afternoon, John was going to eat what I am eating right now on Tuesday, namely the cheese sandwich that I'm eating right now, or a cheese sandwich. Right now doesn't seem to be shifted by Monday afternoon in the same way an hour's time was. An hour's time, when it comes under Monday afternoon, talks about an hour's time from some time on Monday. But even when right now is under Monday afternoon, it still seems to talk about whatever time you started with. So if I say this on a Tuesday, right now is talking about some time on Tuesday. And that's even in spite of the fact that it's under on Monday afternoon. So while we've gained something by giving a simple definition of truth at a time, we've also lost something. We've gained the ability to say why the reference of this is sort of shifty, depending on the bigger sentence it's in. But now we've lost the ability to say why this is not shifty, even if it's in a bigger sentence, and even if it's under an expression that tends to shift other things. So we still haven't explained the contrast.